Hello YouTube! So, what have we done so far? Well, we've seen 4 problems: identities, substitutivity, empty terms and negative existentials, and we've seen how 2 philosophers, Frege and Meinong, responded to those problems. We also saw that Russell could not accept either solution, so naturally he developed his own solution. That's what we'll be dealing with today. Here are the problems, just to jog your memory. Now, Russell's solution comes in 2 parts. He firstly gave an analysis of definite descriptions, hence why it's called a theory of descriptions. Definite descriptions are expressions of the form the such and such. So the composer of Joe's garage, the smallest prime number, and so on. Obviously, though, if we only analyse definite descriptions, our theory will be fairly limited. You can see that our problems apply not just to definite descriptions, but also to proper names. So the second part of Russell's theory shows how to extend his treatment of definite descriptions to other expressions. And that gives us the complete theory. Right, let's start with his analysis of definite descriptions. Firstly, Russell claims that definite descriptions are not referring terms at all, but incomplete symbols. Essentially, an incomplete symbol is something that has no meaning in isolation, it has meaning only in context. So we would usually think that the description, the composer of Joe's garage, has meaning in itself. But according to Russell, this is mistaken. It's only in the context of a sentence, such as the composer of Joe's garage was American, that the description has any meaning. Now, the reasons for this view will become clear soon. That's sort of the first basic idea, Russell, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Secondly, Russell makes an important distinction between grammatical form and logical form. Right, so the first, grammatical form, is the superficial form of an expression. So if you take the composer of Joe's garage was American, well, we've mentioned that what seems to be going on here is we seem to be picking out an object, namely the composer of Joe's garage, Frank Zappa. We're picking out an object, then predicating a property to him, namely being an American. And so that's what the superficial grammatical form of this expression would lead us to believe. Now, logical form is different. The logical form of an expression is what's really going on in the expression. It's how the expression really works. And this can be very different from the superficial surface grammatical form. So why should we believe that how a statement really works is different from how it looks? Well, to motivate this idea, consider the statement, Frank bought a gerbil. Now, in terms of superficial grammatical form, it's tempting to see this as expressing a relation between Frank and some object, the object being a gerbil, and the relation is that Frank bought it. But let's consider this more deeply. What object could a gerbil be? When we say Frank bought a gerbil, we don't necessarily have any particular gerbil in mind. So if you take 2 gerbils, Richie and Eddie, suppose Frank buys Richie. Well, in this case, the statement Frank bought Eddie the gerbil is false, but Frank bought a gerbil is still true. In fact, Frank bought a gerbil is true for any gerbil Frank might have bought. Now, on the other hand, of course, if you were to name a particular gerbil, if you were to say Frank bought Richie the gerbil, then the truth of that depends on the gerbil being a particular gerbil. We can see that there's a particular gerbil to which Richie the gerbil refers. So to drive the point home, suppose Bob buys Eddie. Well, in that case, Bob bought a gerbil is true, just as Frank bought a gerbil is true. So here we can see that a gerbil can't denote a particular gerbil, because 1 and 2 are both true, and yet Frank and Bob both bought different gerbils. So the superficial grammatical form of Frank bought a gerbil is somewhat misleading. It suggests that we have a relation between 2 objects. However, we can see that it would be mistaken to suppose that there's an object to which a gerbil corresponds. The logical form of the statement is more like this. So we have our original statement. The logical form is more like number 3 here. For those of you who are not familiar with logic, here's a key. So what number 3 says is, it says, there exists an X such that X is a gerbil and Frank bought X. Now as you can see, this is true no matter which particular gerbil Frank bought. X can stand for Richie, Eddie, Dave, Spud, or any other gerbil. Note also that there's nothing in this expression that directly corresponds to a gerbil, where we interpret that as referring to an object. The use of the phrase in that sense simply disappears on analysis. Nothing here is picking out a particular object. X is just a variable that can stand for any object. So when we reveal the logical form of statement number 1, we're no longer tempted to take a gerbil as referring to a particular gerbil. Now we can perform a similar operation with definite descriptions. Consider the statement, the composer of Joe's Garage was American. Now according to Russell, this simple looking phrase actually has a very complex logical form, and it all comes in 3 parts. So first of all, the first part is, it says, there exists an X such that X composed Joe's Garage. Okay, that's reasonable enough. Next we have, for all X, if X composed Joe's Garage, then for all Y, if Y composed Joe's Garage, then Y is X. And finally, for all X, if X composed Joe's Garage, then X is American. Now all of these are equivalent to a single formula, which says, there is an X such that X composed Joe's Garage, and for all Y, if Y composed Joe's Garage, then Y is X and X is American. Okay, this may be looking quite confusing at the moment for those of you who are not so familiar with predicate logic. This may be looking quite complicated, but to put it in less formal terms, what's being said here is this: at least one person composed Joe's Garage. At most one person composed Joe's Garage, and whoever composed Joe's Garage was American. Okay, that's what statement number 4 really means, according to Bertrand Russell. This is the basic informal form of Russell's analysis of descriptions. So this very complicated bunch of formulas up here, and also this single formula here, these 3 statements are what they mean. That's what they're saying. Now, according to Russell, the composer of Joe's Garage was American is simply an abbreviation for these 3 claims. And this is not such a radical thesis. After all, the composer of Joe's Garage was American does intuitively entail these 3 statements. That is, the truth of each of these statements is intuitively necessary and sufficient for the truth of number 4. And this is a point in favour of the theory. Now, an important point to note here is that the description, the composer of Joe's Garage, does not in itself have any translation anywhere above. In itself, it has no logical form. No part of these propositions, no part of anything up here, corresponds to our definite description. So we can see that it's an incomplete symbol. It has meaning only in context. It has meaning only when we attach something such as was American to the end of it, and it disappears when we analyse the logical form of expressions containing it. Right then, so that's Russell's theory there. Let's put this theory to work on our problems. So, identity. The composer of Joe's Garage is the composer of Joe's Garage. The composer of Joe's Garage is Frank Zappa. Now the logical form of this statement is this: there exists an X such that X composed Joe's Garage, and for all Y, if Y composed Joe's Garage, then Y is X and X is Frank Zappa. Or in other words, at least one person composed Joe's Garage, at most one person composed Joe's Garage. Whoever composed Joe's Garage is Frank Zappa. So this clearly explains how our second statement here can be non-trivial. The point, of course, is that the composer of Joe's Garage, the description, does not in fact pick out an object. we do not simply have two terms which refer to the same object being substituted for one another. See, in this case, we don't really have an identity statement. What we're doing in statement number 2 is attributing a relational property to Frank Zappa. So it's clear then how this can be non-trivial, whereas the first is only trivial. Right, substitutivity. So Derek believes that the composer of Joe's Garage is a famous musician. Derek believes that the person staying next door is a famous musician. We will suppose that, unbeknownst to Derek, the man in the hotel room right next to his is Frank Zappa, who composed Joe's Garage. As you can see, the definite description in this case occurs inside the belief operator, so we have to apply the analysis to that part of the sentence. And this gives us, in the case of number 1, we have Derek believes that at least one person composed Joe's Garage, etc. In the case of number 2, we have Derek believes that at least one person is staying next door, etc. And the problem, of course, is that in each case we're attributing different beliefs to Derek. Derek may not have any idea that there's at least one man staying next door, and so on. So 1A and 2A clearly attribute different beliefs to Derek. It's worth noting that there's another reading of these two sentences. There's another way to translate them. We could translate them like this. So, exactly one person composed Joe's Garage, and Derek believes that that person is a famous musician. Exactly one person is staying next door, and Derek believes that that person is a famous musician. Now, in these cases, when we talk about the person who composed Joe's Garage, or the person staying next door, we're not specifying the content of Derek's thoughts. We're just using the descriptions to fix the reference. So we're using the description composer of Joe's Garage or person staying next door to specify that we're talking about Frank Zappa. We're not using those to specify the content of Derek's thoughts. Now, more formally, the two sets would be written like this. The first two would be Derek believes, yes, that. I won't say the whole thing. And these two up here would be translated like this. Now, in the first reading, Derek believes that is said to have wide scope, because our phrase, exactly one person composed Joe's Garage, etc., falls within its scope. It falls within the scope of the belief operator, which you can see quite clearly here. You have the whole construction here falling within the scope of the belief operator. In the second, it has only narrow scope, because in this case, of course, it only applies to the famous musician part. Now, when the belief construction has only narrow scope, it's not so important how we specify the reference. Whether we say it's composer of Joe's Garage or person staying next door doesn't really matter. But when it has wide scope, when our description falls within the scope of the belief operator, then it does matter what description we choose, because in that case we are talking about Derek's beliefs. So we have to be careful not to confuse these different scopes, the wide scope and narrow scope, and that's probably where the sort of problem with our original two statements comes from, is because we kind of confuse these different scopes. Okay, now I just want to note, with regard to the problems of identity and of substitutivity in opaque contexts, it's important not to take Russell's solution too far. So it can be tempting to say that the reason we can't substitute one definite description for another is that definite descriptions are incomplete symbols. So since the composer of Joe's Garage disappears under analysis, we of course can't substitute anything for it, because it's an incomplete symbol. It disappears on analysis, so it's not really there, as it were. So how would you be able to substitute on something that's not really there, that doesn't really function as it seems to? Indeed, Russell himself seemed to hold a view something along these lines, but this would be taking the analysis too far, for a reason pointed out, as far as I'm aware, by Kenneth Taylor in his Intro to Philosophy of Language. Taylor uses this example of an inference. Smith is next to the blue car is the fastest car in town, therefore Smith is next to the fastest car in town. Now note that there's nothing superficially wrong with this inference, indeed it seems to be perfectly valid. But if we say that the reason the inference about identity or the inference about Derek's beliefs, if we say that the reason those inferences are invalid is because definite descriptions are incomplete symbols and thus can't be substituted for one another, then this inference must be invalid too. Number 3 must be invalid too. After all, this inference works by substituting definite descriptions. But it would be very implausible to say that this inference is invalid. So the problems with our troublesome inferences can't derive just from the use of definite descriptions. There has to be more involved. The point is that no theory about definite descriptions, no theory about singular terms in general, can fully explain the puzzles about substitution in identity statements and in belief contexts, because there are plenty of cases where substituting on definite descriptions is perfectly reasonable. If our theory tells us that this inference about Smith and his car, if our theory tells us that this is invalid, then that should suggest that there's something wrong with our theory. So we don't really want it to have to say that. Nevertheless, the theory certainly does shine a lot of light on the puzzles, so it must be commended for that. Right. Empty terms. So, the present King of France is bald, and the logical form of this statement would be at least one person is presently King of France, or rather in Russell's terms, since we're predicating a property of an object, we should say at least one person presently kings France, at most one person presently kings France, and whoever presently kings France is bald. Well, it's easy to see what the problem is here. 1a is false. There is no present King of France, so it's false to say that at least one person is presently kinging France. And since the present King of France is bald is merely the conjunction of these 3 propositions here, the present King of France is bald is false too. So we've seen that the intuitive response, and indeed Frege's response, is that statement 1 has no truth value. It's neither true nor false. But of course this would violate the law of the excluded middle, and that was unacceptable for Russell. So Russell's analysis has shown that actually number 1 is neither true nor false, it's simply false. So the law of excluded middle is saved. It's fairly simple, that one. Of course, there might be a little snag here. It's false that the present King of France is bald. Does this mean it's true that the present King of France is not bald? Well, no. Again, the problem here comes from confusing scope distinctions. We have to be careful with the scope of negation. Right, if I ask for the negation of the present King of France is bald, so I ask for the negation of this statement, it is tempting to say the present King of France is not bald, and the present King of France is not bald translates like this. There exists an x such that x is x presently kings France, and for all y, if y presently kings France, then y equals x and x is not bald. But this is wrong. We've given the negation a narrow scope and it should be given a wide scope. If we're going to negate statement 1, we have to negate the whole statement, not simply the baldness. So we should say it is not the case that the present King of France is bald, or not the present King of France is bald, which has the translation, this translation here. As you can see, the negation occurs at the start of the formula. So in this case it has wide scope. Here the negation is negating the whole formula, whereas in this case it's negating only the part about baldness. The difference between 2 and 3 should be obvious. Statement 2, the narrow scope negation, asserts that there is exactly one object which presently kings France, and that this object is not bald. And statement 3, on the other hand, asserts that there does not exist an object which presently kings France, and that object is bald. Statement 2 is clearly false. Statement 3 is clearly true. To enumerate the 4 possibilities we actually have here, we have all of these. Now the first 2 assert that there exists an object which presently kings France, and therefore they're obviously false. The second assert that there does not exist such an object, so they're true. So that's empty terms. Okay, negative existentials. The present king of France does not exist. Now, as noted, the problem here is that we seem to be both asserting and denying the existence of the present king of France. In this case, our analysis gives us at least one person presently kings France, at most one person presently kings France. Whoever presently kings France does not exist. Oh dear. What does this mean? Has Russell's analysis stumbled at 1C? Yet again, we seem to be caught up in this tangle of both asserting and denying the existence of something. If we're successfully denoting a person who presently kings France, they must in some sense exist, making 1C false. On the other hand, if nobody presently kings France, then we can't be denoting anything, so the statement seems meaningless. The original problem has not been solved, it's just pushed back a little. So, has Russell's analysis fallen here? No. Again, the problem is due to misreading the scope of the negation. The problem is that we're assuming that the negation modifies the verb exist. So, does not exist. We're assuming it modifies the verb exist. Now, in fact, it should be taken as modifying, not as modifying a verb, but as applying to the statement as a whole, which gives us, it is not the case that the present king of France exists. Now, we shouldn't think that this is some formal trick, since obviously this is exactly what would be meant by somebody who says the present king of France does not exist. In other words, when you say the present king of France does not exist, at least under normal circumstances, you would mean just that it's not the case that the present king of France exists. So we apply Russell's analysis to everything inside the negation, everything inside the not. We put the not at the beginning, just like this. There does not exist an X such that X presently kings France, and so on. Actually, more properly, since the backwards EX, since that means there exists, we should actually write it this way. Rather than having existence as a predicate here, standardly it would be written like this. You wouldn't write X exists, you would write there exists a Z such that Z equals X, but that's a technical point of little importance. Now the point is that this is perfectly reasonable. The problem has been dissolved. It is not the case that at least one person presently kings France, at most one person presently kings France, however presently kings France exists. There's nothing wrong with that analysis there. That is exactly what we should want it to look like. So we have solved the 4 puzzles. Right, we've seen how Russell's analysis handles definite descriptions. Serious problem is that definite descriptions are not the only singular terms. It could barely have escaped notice that every one of those problems applies to proper names too. And since every one of these problems applies equally to proper names, no theory about definite descriptions alone is going to solve them. Now for Frege and Meinong, note that this is hardly a problem, since their theories are quite general. Frege can say that both definite descriptions and proper names have sensors above their reference. Meinong can say that both definite descriptions and proper names refer to non-existent objects. Russell's theory is specifically about definite descriptions. It's an analysis of the logical form of definite descriptions, so that kind of response is hardly open to him. He needs to show how this analysis can be extended to proper names. This is the second part of his theory. Well, the solution is simple. According to Russell, names are not really names. At the level of logical form, names are simply abbreviations of definite descriptions. So, Bob Dylan is an abbreviation for something like the musician who wrote Like a Rolling Stone. Now, there is actually some intuitive plausibility here. After all, if somebody doesn't know who Bob Dylan is, we would probably respond with a description. We might say he's the musician who wrote Like a Rolling Stone. And this is in fact one of the only ways of learning what names mean. So you can meet somebody for the first time and they can tell you their name. But we also know the names of many people we've never had any kind of acquaintance with. I've never met Bob Dylan, but I know who he is because I know the right descriptions and I can explain these descriptions to others. Now, if names are equivalent to definite descriptions, then the solutions we saw above obviously apply to proper names too. So Bob Dylan equals Bob Dylan is treated just the same as the musician who wrote like a Rolling Stone equals the musician who wrote like a Rolling Stone. Sherlock Holmes means something like the famous detective who lives on Baker Street, which would give us the famous detective who lives on Baker Street is not bald, the famous detective who lives on Baker Street does not exist. Obviously, these can receive the same treatment as the propositions about the present King of France. Indeed, I think Russell's case here is best made with reference to fictional names like Sherlock Holmes. After all, if fictional names aren't abbreviations of descriptions, then what are they? So if you consider a real name, like Bob Dylan, take Bob Dylan, well, we can plausibly say that it simply refers to the man Bob Dylan. By pointing to Bob Dylan, we can show what the name Bob Dylan means. But with Sherlock Holmes, there is no man to whom we can refer. We can't point to a man and say, Sherlock Holmes is that man. We can only specify who Sherlock Holmes is. We can only say what the name Sherlock Holmes means by providing a description. We have to characterise Sherlock Holmes. It's up to us to provide that description. So the claim that names abbreviate descriptions is perfectly plausible with fictional names. And given that, what reason is there to suppose that real names work differently? After all, consider debates about the historicity of Jesus. There are people who claim that Jesus did exist and people who claim that he didn't. Whatever position you might have on this debate, the important thing to note is that there doesn't seem to be any difference in how either group uses the name Jesus. So whether we're talking about entities we take to exist or entities we take to be fictional, the name of that entity seems to be used in the same way. So overall, the claim that names are abbreviations of descriptions has the following support. It provides a simple solution to the puzzles. It accords with how names are used and learned. It seems to be the only reasonable analysis for fictional names, and with that in mind, if we accept that fictional names are equivalent to descriptions, it's theoretically parsimonious. It makes our theory simpler to suppose that real names work the same way. Well, that's that. To sum up, ultimately, Russell's theory has two parts. Firstly, his theory of descriptions proper, which is that definite descriptions don't have subject-predicate form but are trios of generalizations. And secondly, that proper names are abbreviations of descriptions. How does this theory stack up? Well, I'm sure you can see that it's a very powerful theory. It may even be a stroke of genius. But of course it's also quite implausible at times. Well, we'll take a look at some of the criticisms and defences of the theory in the next video. I think we've done enough for today. So thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.